All right. So now that we have talked a little bit about our introduction to the class, we've talked a little bit about this debunking a little bit of the myth of George Washington. Let's start to dive into the early life of George Washington, and we want to take a look at his childhood and his family and upbringing because that'll give us a little bit of an idea of what we can expect from him moving forward. We want to talk about a little bit of his earliest days as a surveyor, which will really sort of set him up to become a soldier in the French and Indian War as part of the Virginia militia, in which he will never really ever be able to fulfill his goal of becoming a British officer. And we'll talk more about that as well. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And we'll take a look at this. All right. So, so let's talk a little bit about his early life first, right? And let's start way back with when the first Washingtons make their way over into the British colonies, right? And it begins with John Washington, George's great grandfather. Okay, he's born in 1631 in England, the fifth son of Reverend Lawrence Washington. In 1642, let me go back for a second here because let's take a look at that, right? He's the fifth son of Reverend Lawrence Washington, okay? And so what that means is that in England at that time, there was something known as primogeniture, okay? And really what that said was unless you were the firstborn son was the individual who would inherit all of the land from their father, okay? So if you weren't the firstborn son, then that lack of primogeniture meant that you didn't really have much of a future in England. So a lot of the individuals who were coming into the British colonies to try to make a new way for themselves were doing so because they weren't firstborn sons, right? And that was the situation with John Washington. So he fights in the English Civil War, which pitted the royalists and the parliamentarians against each other, right? And then comes over and settles along the Potomac River in 1657. And then he actually will have his son Nathaniel Pope, who he will introduce his son John to Nathaniel Pope's 20-year-old daughter Anne. Right, and this is one of the things that I want to point out here as well is that, and you're going to see this in the next slide, but there is sort of a pattern that all of the Washington males follow. Okay, and we'll talk about that in just a second, right? But Nathaniel Pope was a magistrate. John is introduced to his 20-year-old daughter Anne, and they marry, and then he dies early, right? At the age of 46 in his late 1760s. Okay, so that's sort of the origin story, if you will, of the Washingtons coming to the New World, right? But here's that what I'm talking about, that life cycle of Washington males in British America, right? Obviously, from John on, they're all born in America. Okay. Really, up until George, they are all sent to England for proper education. With the untimely death of Augustine, George's father, George is not able to go to England and get that formal education as his brothers had done, right? They eventually will all come back to Virginia to become tobacco planters, as was George, okay? They will all, for the most part, marry up in status, and George is no stranger to that as well. His marriage to Martha, who was extremely wealthy as a result of her previous marriages to husbands who had passed away, really elevates his status now as being part of the social elite. Okay, so he's not somebody who's born into that. He marries into that, as many of the Washington males did. He does hold public office, as all the males did. Now, this is the one trend that he sort of went away from, in that they all died young. Right? George doesn't necessarily fall into that. George dies 1799, so he's late 60s when he dies, which in the life expectancy of an 18th century male is a pretty full life. And we'll talk about the death of George Washington and all that surrounded that in week 5, right? But that's kind of the life cycle of what we're looking at with Washington males, right? So this right here is part of the exhibit that's in the museum at Mount Vernon. They have a wonderful museum down there that's in addition to the house tour. If you ever have a chance to get down to Mount Vernon, it's something that I would highly recommend. It really is a great place to visit. There's not only the house tour, which I would say is probably the least intriguing of all of the things there is to do down there, but there's also the museum, which has some wonderful exhibits depicting the life, some great interactive exhibits as well. There's also the grounds where you can really see the level of how this plantation would have worked with slaves and where they lived, the trades that were done on site, the livestock, right? All of that is sort of featured on the grounds of Mount Vernon. And then the other neat thing that we see is that, and this is getting ahead of myself here, but the evolution of George Washington is to move away from tobacco planting and move into grain. And that grain, there's a wonderful grist mill that's down there that still functions as well, where you can see how this grain would have been formed into flour, right? And then he had a Scottish overseer who suggested he make whiskey. So there's a distillery that's still down there as well, and it's a distillery that is licensed by the state of Virginia to make whiskey, and it's extremely expensive, right? But that distillery is down there as well. So this is showing us here sort of the early life as we trace, right? So Washington is born here at Pope's Creek in 1732. Okay. And then there's a fire, and that fire forces the family to move along the Rappahannock here in 1739. And then this becomes Ferry Farm, and this is where his mother will continue to live throughout her life, right? And then Washington will move with Lawrence to Little Hunting Creek property here, later called Mount Vernon. Now it's called Mount Vernon because Lawrence had served in a war with the British Navy, and his commanding officer was a guy by the name of Edward Vernon. And he names the property after that as well, right? And this is where Washington will eventually take ownership of that and begin to expand upon what that looks like. It's a very humble house to start with, and as Washington climbs the social circles, that continues to grow as well, okay? Again, he doesn't have the classic education as many of his peers will have, but it isn't that he is uneducated. And I think that's the big knock on Washington, is that we think no classical education, he must have just been some big lunkhead who really only had a military career ahead of him. That's not true, right? We see that this Rules of Civility of Decent Behavior was a book that was very influential, and Washington will really transcribe the book in his own hand. And it's a book that is interesting because it talks about all of these rules that a young man should follow in order to be considered a gentleman. And if you ever had a chance to check that out, it's worth checking out to see some of the interesting little tidbits that are in there of suggestions on how to behave appropriately, right? But that copy that he makes of Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior will become part of the path that Washington takes for himself as far as self-betterment, right? He latches on to his half-brother, Lawrence, who exposes him to the Virginia gentry, including the Fairfax family. The Fairfax family lived sort of, I guess, what we would call down the street from the Washingtons at Mount Vernon, right? They were right down a couple properties down, or a couple farms away, and the Fairfaxes are the elite of the elite in the social circles of Virginia at that time, right? And so Washington does well to endear himself with William Fairfax, and it's through that teaching of math and science techniques and surveying that really launches Washington's career, right? And Washington begins doing surveying tasks for the Fairfaxes, and will eventually then do so in an official capacity for the colony of Virginia, right? And so, in a not necessarily traditional sense, Washington does have these paths that lead him to not to overcoming this lack of classical education, right? And surveying is one of that. And what I've done here is to better understand what surveying looks like in this time period, I've provided a link for you for a 9-minute video that I think is worth taking a look at, because it's an individual who discusses the tools and trades of a surveyor. Now, he is explaining it in the mid-1800s, but there wasn't a whole lot that had changed between when Washington would have been doing this and when it would have been done in the 1800s. So I think it's worth taking a look at, right? So that's Washington's first sort of sending off in life is as a surveyor, right? And essentially what a surveyor does is they have this compass on a staff, right? And you can see how these compasses have these little holes in them, right? And so the compass would be on, think of a long staff. You'll see this in the video, right? And essentially what you would do is you would, with your eye, you would match up a common point. Maybe it's a tree in the distance, and you would line up the 2 points, and then you would see what the angle was from where you were standing and write that angle down. And then as you're writing these angles down and you're ready to transcribe this onto a survey, you would use those angles, right? And then you would figure out distance using these chains called a Gunter change, right? And usually these chains were about 66 feet in length, okay? You could have also used smaller chains, as Washington might have used, right? And that's how you would have also figured out the distance between places. And this would have all been important because speculating land in the frontier of Virginia and being able to survey that land and have the colony of Virginia certify that the land that you surveyed is in fact yours would have really done a lot to project the wealth of the individuals during this time, right? And then this is some of the tools that you see down here that would have been used in plotting the measure or creating the drawings, if you will, right? That you would have done from the angles and the distance that you've seen there. So again, go ahead and check out the video that I've posted, because that will go a long way. Here's an early survey that Washington did for Fairfax, and we can sort of see. Now this all has the left-hand side. Here's the drawing, right? And the left-hand side is sort of describing to you what you're seeing on the right-hand side here, okay? And so that would have been an early survey. And Washington is learning through an early education in some of the tools of the trade, if you will, as far as the industry classics of books that would have been used to learn. And these are both part of Washington's permanent collection in the vault that you'll see that I was telling you about earlier as well, right? And it helps them gain that experience needed, okay? This is his first plot that he surveys, okay? And it's the area around Mount Vernon. It's an area called Hellhole, right? Not a very appealing place, right? But this is so this is some of the early attempts of Washington at surveying. And then he goes on to draw the plan of this through Washington's for the turnip field that Lawrence will have as well, okay? So he breaks into the business in 1747. At that point, he's what, 15 years old, right? 15, 16. And he's essentially just kind of an assistant joining a survey party with George William Fairfax. Belvoir was the name of their house where they lived, okay? And then 2 years later, he receives his own commission to be a surveyor for Culpeper County. And then really it's a quick education from there, because by 1752 he's completing nearly 200 surveys totaling nearly 60,000 acres. And then what this will really do is this will open up the French frontier for him. So when the British need to get a message to the French, who have created a fort in what's modern day Pittsburgh, Washington's the guy really to lead that expedition to tell them to get out, because he knows the land so well. They're due to his surveying. So really his surveying launches his experience as a young soldier, which we'll talk about next, okay? All right, so before we get to that, what I want you to do now is go ahead and take a look at that 9-minute video on surveying, and you'll get a better idea of how that was done. And again, it's because of his surveying that leads to his next role as a young soldier, which we'll talk about next.